Hi everyone, I'm Mike. This has been really the demo day of my nightmares, so we're just going to continue on. Who has built a progressive web app before? Who builds stuff with React? Okay, who builds stuff with Angular? Yeah, my people. Who builds stuff with Vue? All right, that kind of checks out statistics. I mean nothing bad by that. I love all frameworks equally. They are amazing and they make us productive. We are good to go.
Excellent.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm Mike Hartington. I work for a company called Ionic. I'm a GDE in Angular, Firebase, all things web technology. So if you have any questions about any of those topics, find me in the hallway. I'd love to go over all this stuff. And most importantly, I'm on Twitter. I'm Hartington. I have a lot of pictures of my cats. And the internet runs on cats. So by posting more pictures of my cats, I'm therefore helping the internet. I did say that I work for Ionic. Who's ever used Ionic before? I wish I saw more hands, but that's all right. We're not actually going to talk about Ionic today. Ionic actually, as a sales pitch, the only thing really is Ionic works with Angular, React, and Vue. So if you want to build a PWA and you want a pretty awesome UI library, we're an option. But this talk is going to be pretty much UI library agnostic. What we're going to talk about is progressive web apps. And really kind of breaking down how to build effective progressive web apps across each framework and what some of the tools that you want to be aware of. But just so that way we are on a even playing field, what is a progressive web app? It is this great approach to taking a traditional website, adding a little bit of JSON, and this thing called Service Worker, which we'll look at in a bit, and creating a website that can work offline, be saved to a user's home screen, and take advantage of newer features that are available in the browser. Now, we are not shipping a progressive web app. We are not selling a progressive web app. We are just taking a website and adding some extra bits to it to make it special. People say, I'm a progressive web app expert. You're really a responsive website developer. It's kind of this really unfortunate naming thing where people say, oh, it's progressive web app. It's a completely different thing than my website. No, it's not. But it does have some key characteristics that we should be aware of. Progressive web apps should be fast. So I should be able to load a PWA on a mobile device, limited network connectivity, maybe 2G, 3G, and it should load relatively fast. It should be secure, and that's kind of a no-brainer these days, as browsers will actually block non-secure websites. So if you're trying to load something over HTTP, your browser will put up this really scary warning saying, hey, this site is not secure. It may be susceptible to, man-in-the-middle attacks. So the fact that everything needs to be secure is should be secure anyway. Security should not be an afterthought. And offline, I would weigh this more towards the lower end of importance. Having good offline support is great, but not everything needs to be offline. You really want to focus on the speed and being able to return content a lot faster to your users. Now, PWAs are really just marketing words. A really smart person said this, and I really think that this is true. You're not doing anything extra. You're building a website, and yes, you're following best practices for performance. You just happen to get this new form factor and this new feature. Now, this talk actually was inspired by another talk that I saw way at the beginning of what I would consider my actual career. In 2014, there was this really great talk at JSConf called Embular Actimabone, where it looked at Ember, AngularJS, Polymer, React, Backbone. Any Backbone fans? Just me? I long for the simplicity of Backbone sometimes. But this talk by Ryan Florence of React fame basically looked at all of these modern, at the time, frameworks and asked the question, what are these tools and what are these libraries concerned about? Developer experience, file structure, routing, components, like not how good are each of these frameworks, but where do they focus a lot of their time on getting developers onto this happy path? I figured that this was a really good way to evaluate these tools. So how concerned are frameworks with progressive web apps? Saying, oh, React's better for progressive web apps is kind of a subjective statement. But how concerned is React with progressive web apps? What tools do they give developers to give them a fast progressive web app experience? Same thing with Angular, same thing with Vue. And as this should be noted, this is my opinion. Leave this talk with your own ideas and evaluate them. If I don't touch on certain subjects that you think I should have talked about, write them down, post them, share these ideas. This is how conversations should happen. So I broke down the key characteristics of progressive web apps into three spots. Code splitting, lazy loading, and service workers. These are like the three things that I think every framework should kind of help developers to get them on the happy path to a good progressive web app. And I'm only going over Angular, React, and Vue because there is a new framework every 5 minutes, it feels like. And we are 6 minutes into this talk, so there is a new framework and another one has already been started. So it's impossible to keep up. Practices, though, kind of can translate frameworks. So if you focus on those parts, whatever framework or whatever library you're using, it should matter, or it should apply to that. So progressive web apps in Angular. Well, first let's define what Angular is. It's a framework for mobile and desktop. It has this concept of decorators, of being able to take a class and say, hey, I want to add some extra functionality with it, but not really have to make developers code that. It's kind of an idea like higher order components, but without having to actually write that higher order function. It has this thing called dependency injection, which is a pretty polarizing idea in JavaScript, to say the least. But if you're from, if you have anyone has Java background, dependency injection, it's a cool thing, right? I actually like it. It makes adding and sharing dependency services across my framework or across my app much easier. And then I think the coolest feature about Angular is that there is this awesome CLI to kind of make making apps a lot easier and scaling across not single app, but multiple projects and creating monorepositories where you could have 4 or 5 n number of apps existing right next to each other and scale that in a pretty easy way. So we're looking at code splitting first. Code splitting in Angular is, and what I mean by code splitting first is, I want to say I'm going to load piece A first because that is what I need for this particular section. If I go to a new route, I need to load all those other pieces when I request them. So we're it's kind of doing lazy loading, but it's also splitting up that build results to get multiple different chunks. Now in Angular, this is driven by their router, and it uses this really Angular-specific thing called ng modules to define how a chunk should exist. And as of recently, we get cool things like dynamic imports, which are a million times better than the old way of random string references. So let's take a look at how this works. How can you see that? How well can you see that in the back? Yay, day? Okay, we'll do this. We'll zoom in a little bit. So here we have an example where we have a route definition for an entire app, where we have our default route up here at the top, where we're doing an inline reference to a component. So when our app actually builds, we're going to include landing page in the final bundle. that's fine. Landing page is probably not a whole lot. It's probably like maybe a component or two, no services, no extra bits. So we can include that into a main bundle. But I know for a fact that search page has a lot going on. So I'm going to use this load children property, and I'm going to split this out into its own chunk. And we're going to use dynamic imports right here to do that. So as I go through search page, I'm going to get that dynamic import, and I'm going to resolve the module that comes from that request. So all of this will say we'll create a new module for playlist, we'll create a new module for album, and a new module for search and browse. So all these will get split out into their own separate pieces. Our minimum requirement for our main.js will be rather tiny versus having to include all of it in that main bundle. This is great, but this is where we get into some architectural kind of debates. ng modules, once you split something out into its own chunk with the router, you need to redeclare that specific chunk's dependencies. Now, this is done with ng module. I hear it's going to be optional in the future. Don't quote me on that. But for now, the state of the art says, once something is split out, we have to use ng modules to redeclare all of our dependencies and essentially take this page or this component and say, could we bootstrap this by itself? Basically, could this single instance be instantiated without the rest of my app and be functional? I think that's a good mentality for larger apps, maybe not the best for progressive web apps. There's a lot of technical overhead here, and sometimes you get this really confusing, well, I have another ng module for my modules module, and it's just hard to understand sometimes. It does mean that we also get another route definition for child. Basically, we were saying, okay, the first route that we match at the top level, here is the second level of routing that we could optionally have for this second chunk. So that's code splitting, handled by the router. Any questions about that? No? Okay. We'll look at lazy loading next. Now, I separated lazy loading and code splitting because one of them is for handling routes, and one of these is I already have some UI on my device. I want to dynamically load something without having to bundle it. How do we do this in Angular? Well, we have these mechanisms in place to be able to load a module or load a component and then set up dependency injection for us. This is really confusing and really something that not many people do in Angular. There's a couple helper libraries out there, one called ngx loadable and one called lazyaf. They really are just kind of helper libraries that are going to be on top of this manual way of doing that. So this is taken from the Angular docs, where we have this banner component. And what we're going to do is dynamically load a new component into the banner every 3 seconds. So we're constantly going, we're saying, okay, load something, 3 seconds later, load another one, and just constantly keeping that cycle together. Now, there's a lot going on here, but really the most important part is this load component function and a couple things up here in the constructor. So we basically have this really simple method where we're saying, here is the current index that we want. We're going to get set the current add item to the current index. There we're going to use this component factory resolver dot resolve component factory. If that's not confusing, you are smarter than me. Then we have this container ref, which is basically going to our parent component in this case and just getting a reference to where Angular says it should put things. We're going to clear out any existing content. We're going to use container ref create component and pass it in that component factory, and then pass in any data that we want to that particular component. This is confusing. I don't like this. It's getting better, and they know that this is not ideal. So we've already seen one example where Angular is using dynamic imports. Wouldn't it be great if we could just do that for this? The team agrees, and they are moving towards that in future releases. But as of now, this is what we have to do because of past decisions in Angular's history. So lazy loading isn't something that people really do in Angular, and it's probably one of their weakest points, I would argue. What else can Angular do? Well, we'll look at service workers. So in Angular, service workers are provided by an optional package that you can add. It's called Angular PWA. It'll include the default kind of manifests and app icons for your app, and provide a mechanism for talking to the service worker and registering for updates. So we'll do ng add Angular PWA. It'll go through, do some code mods on our project, and create some new files. One of which will be this ng sw JSON file, where we have this easier way, I would argue, of declaring things that we want to cache. So up here at this first asset group object, we have what we're creating is a cache called app. Basically, while our app is loading and when service worker has been registered, we're going to load all these other assets in the background and cache them. This is called an app shell pattern. Basically, all the assets and everything will be available, so as soon as people start to load and request our site, they'll have the resources to be able to at least show them something. This next object down here called assets is basically everything else that we could possibly need inside of our app, so images, fonts, whatever, where we're basically saying the install mode is going to be lazy. Basically, as they are requested, cache them. We don't really need them for startup, but update them whenever the user has cache them as soon as the user has requested them, and then update them in the background periodically. We register this this service worker. What this will actually do is create this ng sw worker file for us, and this is part of that ng add option where it'll do code mods. We'll enable it only for production because caching development assets doesn't necessarily make sense. And then if we want to actually provide some kind of UI or feedback to our users, we get this SW update class inside of the Angular service worker package, where we can listen to updates and use this subscribe function to say, are there updates? Yes. Activate these updates and maybe present a UI to the users, maybe just call window.reload, or handle it however you want. We have some mechanisms to do that. So how concerned is Angular? I would say code splitting, especially now with dynamic imports, pretty easy to do. You do have that caveat of ng modules. You take the good with the bad. Lazy loading is probably its weakest point. And then service worker, because it's an add-on and not part of the default package, I'll knock a point from that. Because really, you're not losing anything by adding that. You should have that by default. Okay, that was a lot of Angular. Let's move to React. React in a nutshell, it's a UI layer. You basically take everything that you would want to show and then figure out the rest of your app, like routing, requests, state management. That's up to you or the community. This decision has really made React become really popular because there's like a million ways to do state management. Whether that's a good thing, who knows? The React community says that is a good thing because there are options, which, okay. Some really popular concepts. There's React Router, Redux, and this newfangled thing called hooks. I'm still trying to figure out why it's so much better than everything else. People argue with me and say that it is better, but I don't know. Code splitting in React. As of React 16.6, we have these two new features called React Lazy and Suspense to be able to say, request this component, set its props, and then provide fallback content with suspense, so that way we don't have any blank screens. React Router will actually integrate with this and be able to handle lazy loading as route change. And like I said, fallback content for when that content is actually being requested. So typical React Router setup. We have a couple imports up here at the top. We have our main router, and then all the different routes that we're going to actually load. How easy is it to use code splitting in React Lazy? Our direct imports actually become a dynamic import, and we wrap it with this lazy or react.lazy function. Now, what this is actually doing is, as it is resolving all of these components, any data that we could be getting down here in our route, so any component props, it's going to set that on the component and return them. Now, as these are dynamic imports, we have to deal with the network, so how we use suspense over here to provide some fallback content. That could be another component. I was lazy, I just use a div with loading ... And pretty much we're done. It's pretty nice. I like it a lot. I think this is actually a pretty nice way of handling all this. Now, lazy loading. Surprise, surprise, React just says, okay, well, if we're focusing just on components, the router can handle lazy loading and code splitting. We'll use React Lazy and Suspense to handle dynamic loading of components. It's the same mechanism, so as soon as you learn it the first time, it's easy to re-implement across your app. A thing to note is that your exports, they should be default exports in every single component. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you to decide. I think it's kind of weird. I don't like default exports, but React says that that's how it should be done. Yeah?
When you say the default export, you mean your top level component that's rendered by the router? That one must be the default.
Yeah, so when you are writing your component and you say, if you're using class syntax, you'd say export default my class name, or class my class name, and then pass that object. Or if you're using function, you would create like const my component, create your stateless function, and then say export default, pass that component in. Now, as we're going and using this, again, we'll just use lazy to import this song item. And then this example, I shortened it a little bit, and now I'm kicking myself. But as we type in this input, it should lazy load the song item as it is attempted to be rendered. So as this is dynamically updated, we'll make that initial request for the component and load it up. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward, easy to understand once you learn it that first time. Service workers in React are the bad part. React kind of has a meh approach to service workers, and mainly React scripts is reluctant to enable them by default, which, again, you don't lose anything by enabling them, but you gain so much by enabling service workers. So when you create a new project with React, create React app, you'll get this little note over here. If you want your app to work offline and load faster, you can change this unregistered to register. Cool, so you're saying I could get faster performance by enabling this, yet they don't enable this. They do lead to some docs basically describing what part of the network can mess around with. So we comment out unregister, we create our new register function, call register, and then we're done, right? Not really. So under the hood, Create React App uses Workbox Webpack plugin. And I messed that word up like 5 times while practicing this. And it comes up later on again, so I will probably mess it up again. It uses this Webpack plugin to create our cache, create our service worker by analyzing our entire app and creating that cache for us. It'll use its own particular strategy where it'll say, no matter what, go to the cache first, even if the network is newer. And you can't modify that without ejecting, which kind of defeats the whole point of having a build script or having your own build system. Now you have to maintain Webpack, which no one ever wants to do. Once you eject, you have free access to do whatever you want, but now any updates you have to manage and you have to maintain that. And build tools and dependencies are a nightmare. And there's a story behind that, so if you want to figure out that story, find me in the hallway. So how concerned is React with progressive web apps? Code splitting and lazy loading, I would give them 4 out of 5. The only reason why I knock a point is because you need to use this React-specific function to implement your lazy load, your dynamic import, and pass props down. Really, that's me being a nitpicking. It's really good. Service workers, I will deduct 2 points because that whole eject business and not being able to customize it. It's not fun customizing a Webpack setup, especially one by the React team, because it's super advanced. And for the people who are friends of Vue, Vue is this really nice middle ground approach where it's like, what if we cared a little bit more than React, but not as much as Angular? There was a really great talk at ngconf about someone mentioning Vue, and they're saying, who uses Vue.js? People who miss AngularJS. And that, I think, is really true. What we have in here is this approach to create a project, use these really simple patterns for creating components, and a fairly simple CLI to create a project, serve, and then add new features like we would see in Angular. Now, code splitting in Vue is actually done by the router. Again, we'll see a common trend here is that we're going to use dynamic imports to load our components as we need them. And it hooks into Webpack. So now we get all of these different perks that we could get from Webpack, like name chunks, being able to define how that route is loaded. Maybe we want to load it preemptively and kind of have that, stored in memory, so that way as our users navigate, they get that component right away, and there's no wait for the network, then navigate. So Vue's starter project actually provides a dynamic import out of the box, so that's actually really nice. Again, similar to what we saw in our other apps, we have a path, a name, and then our component is just a dynamic import pointing to our Vue component. So this is using Vue's single file components. You can use their JSX components. If anyone knew that Vue has JSX. You do. OK, that's great. Most people don't. But yeah, this is really easy, fairly approachable, same kind of ideas that we were seeing in other frameworks. Here's that instance of using Webpack's own specific magic, where we're giving this a chunk name. So what this will do is, as we go ahead and have Webpack build our app, instead of getting some random digits.js, we'll get browse.randomdigit.js. Maybe it's easier for debugging, or maybe you just want to have some kind of specific cache mechanism. But this is pretty nice to know that you could do this. Lazy loading in Vue. Again, same approach as routing. We have dynamic imports. Once you've learned the concept of how dynamic imports work, you get to use it wherever you want, which really makes Vue great here. So in our example, we have single file component. And the main things to look at are the preview header and song item. These have now been split out into their own files. As this page starts to load, those other assets will be requested in. We'll use this component. I am using decorators over here. I really like them, and it felt like Angular. So we have our dynamic imports where we're defining the name of the components, preview header and song item, and requesting them. So as our component loads up, we'll get those components involved, and then we'll render them to our DOM. Again, similar idea to the router. Once you learn dynamic imports, they're great. Service workers. You actually have an option to add this at the start of a project. Once you do view create, you'll have an option say, do you want to enable progressive web apps? Which will give you service workers and app manifests. And if you already have an existing project and you want to add this, you have another option to just enable that. And again, it'll do some code mods to your project to add everything you need. It can be customized to a degree, as we'll look at. So when we start a new project, we have this really fancy list that we can pick from: Babel, TypeScript, Router, Vuex, progressive web apps. I wish they provided more descriptions, like progressive web apps, cool. Service worker app manifest really is what we're adding here. If we have a project that we have already created and maintained, and now we want to start the process of adding progressive web app features, view add @view /PWA. Pretty nice. You get the best of both worlds and not have to worry. It's like, oh, I didn't add this when I started my project. Now I'm kind of out of luck. Now, once this has run, we'll get this new method basically called, or this new import, which we'll call register service worker. And all this functionality does is have a single call to register a file that we will generate at build time. Now, service workers in Vue, if you want to do any meaningful customization, you kind of have to look at their docs. And by docs, I mean a random README file in their repository, which if you're ambitious enough and you want to go look at someone else's source code, that's cool. But there's no docs basically describing how you should customize this. And really, the reason for that is that the real docs are from Workbox, which we've seen before. Gave away the secret. Which we saw before. It runs React's service worker configuration, and Vue said, yeah, let's do the same thing. So if you want to customize the service worker instance, you basically have cache first, or re-implement everything yourself using Workbox APIs. Workbox APIs are fairly approachable, and once you go through their docs a couple times, you can kind of understand what everything is doing, but it's unfortunate that you have to re-implement that yourself. So, kind of gave the secret away, but how concerned is Vue with progressive web apps? Code splitting and lazy loading, 5 out of 5. There's no extra magic involved. I have dynamic imports. I can split everything out, and I have a good time. Service workers, on the other hand, are probably the weakest part. There's no documentation involved for them. Really, any customization, you're basically bypassing whatever they provide and going down to Workbox, the Workbox Webpack plugin, and handling it that way. So, again, you take the good with the bad, but I would say that's probably the most unfortunate part. So, we've kind of gone through the main projects. What's a key takeaway here? Anyone have an idea what the key takeaway is?
Doesn't matter what you use, it's pretty easy.
No, it's that the points don't matter. The points are like people's opinions online. These are my opinions, right? These are what I've found in building progressive web apps across all these frameworks, which once you get these slides, there's a demo of the same app built 3 different times. depending on how you build and depending on how you work, this could be your opinions and your thoughts on these topics could be different. What is the bottom line is that no framework is a silver bullet. Basically, you're going to have to know some kind of work to make progressive web apps a thing in your app. Abstractions are nice, but at some point you are going to want to dive down into the lower level features of the platform and kind of work with your team. If you have like 3 or 4 developers and you really love React, but they don't, maybe don't use React. Thank you. So the slides are up here, github.com, Hartington, PWAs across frameworks. There's PDF, there's the actual keynote. If you want to modify this presentation and present it yourself with your own opinions, I really encourage that. And the demo for the demos that I built for evaluating all these things are up there as well. Thank you.